Welcome to the discussion, Pep.
Thank you.
In a recent interview, you said that Ukraine war was about preserving U.S. hegemony and preventing a multipolar world. Can you talk more on that?
Well, this is a provoked war, unilaterally, by the United States, using NATO, of course. The U.S. controls NATO from A to Z, against Russia. So this is a proxy war. And Ukraine is in the middle. Ukraine is the cannon fodder. So this is a war until the last Ukrainian. Obviously, the US and NATO cannot say that they are directly involved in this war, but they are. And they were even before the war started. So basically what happened a year ago is that the US lured the Russians to do something about Donbass because an invasion, a blitzkrieg against Donbass by Ukrainian forces that were massed in front of the line of control was imminent. Russian intelligence, they knew that. So they had to react because they were going to prevent a massacre, a genocide of Russian-speaking Ukrainian population in Donbass. So this is the beginning of the war a year ago. But the war started many years ago. In fact, even before 2014 with Maidan in Kiev. So this is a very long story. We can say that this war, this budding war against Russia, has been going on for at least 3 decades since the fall of the Soviet Union.
But if you look at the European countries, they are also suffering, basically suffering from the boomerang effects of their sanctions on Russia, and also because of the energy crisis, partly created by their sanctions. So, what can they benefit from a weakened Russia or serving the U.S. interests of being the only superpower in the world?
Well, the situation of Europe is it's something straight out of a Kafka novel, in fact. I live part-time in Europe. I'm in Paris now. I live part of the year in Paris and the other part of the year across Asia. So I follow Europe from the inside a lot. Many contacts in Brussels, where I worked a lot in the past as well. It's impossible to have a civilized conversation on what the EU is profiting from this war for the past year. In fact, everything that they threw against Russia didn't work. And in fact, the sanctions, they boomeranged and they are hitting diverse EU nations and the EU as a whole really, really heavy. This winter already, and in the next winter is going to be an absolute nightmare because Europe will not have extra sources of oil and gas that they used to buy with very good and cheap prices, in fact, from Russia. And they basically replicate what the Americans tell them to do. And this is in terms of NATO and in terms of the European Union. The way things work here in Europe is basically the Americans give orders, NATO relays these orders to the European Union, and the European Commission, which is the legislative body of the EU, they disseminate that to the 27 EU members. This is how it works. This is something that an average European citizen will never see printed in their newspapers or watch on TV. But this is how the system actually works. So the orders come from the superpower. And the Europeans in the middle, they are basically patsies. They are basically messenger boys. And when they apply a policy which means, okay, let's destroy the Russian economy, they don't know that what they're doing is destroying their own national economies in Germany, in the UK, in France, in Italy. And of course, Russia, that was perfect for Russia in terms of reorienting their trade towards other parts of Eurasia, especially towards Asia as a whole and towards other parts of Eurasia. So that involves China, Iran, India, which, by the way, BRICS members, very important. Russia, China, and India, BRICS members. And Iran is going to be probably a next member of BRICS Plus, the expanded BRICS. So everything that the West threw against Russia, Russia absorbed it, changed their reorientation towards Eurasia, what some Russians call pivot to the east, which is something that was already in progress even before Donbass. And the Russian economy has survived, is doing fine, is doing business with Eurasia partners, and basically the Russian leadership is forgetting about Europe. In fact, they have been saying that for months. There's no point in having business as usual, either with the United States or with Europe. So their focus is across Eurasia. So this is the number one consequence of the sanctions policy that completely floundered from the US and from the EU.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of that, I have to ask you for your comments on the recent revelation of the U.S. bombing of Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1, those pipelines. We know the victims, obviously, one of them is Germany, right?
Yes.
Directly connected with Germany and Russia, with Russian cheap energy, oil and gas. So the U.S. and their senior diplomat Newland basically said publicly the U.S. is very happy to see that. So what are the motivations for the U.S. and what do you think will be the response from the European countries, for example, Germany?
Well, this is very, very important. I wish I had a few hours to discuss with you the repercussions of the bombing of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. All of us independent analysts, since it happened in September, we knew who was behind it. Of course, we didn't know the modus operandi, how it happened. And a Seymour Hersh report, which is absolutely devastating, details the whole chain of command. Who planned the operation, first of all? That's very, very important. According to his source, which is one of his sources inside the deep state, which is obviously appalled at this whole thing. Let's call this source a realist politician or a realist analyst. He said that this was essentially planned by Jake Sullivan, National Security Council advisor, Victoria Nuland, number 2 at the State Department, and Tony Blinken, which is the Secretary of State. So this is the trio that planned the operation. They sold the idea to President Joe Biden, or the man who reads the teleprompter, let's put it this way. And of course, the CIA was on board, the Pentagon was on board. Each one had a different input on how to conclude this operation. Basically, this is a terror operation because this is a geopolitical and environmental terror attack against the infrastructure or sovereign countries, and especially profiting one of American allies, Germany, which is also a NATO member. So this is an extremely serious case of international terrorism. That's what it is. And it's no wonder that the Chinese Foreign Ministry already said, if it's proving that Washington is guilty, they need to explain this to the international community. That's absolutely correct. The thing is, this is not going to happen. Because inside the United States, since the report came out, mainstream media is either ignoring it, demeaning it, attacking the messenger, attacking Seymour Hersh personally, and saying this is basically a blog and it's false. We all know that the narrative, the way Seymour Hersh organized in his piece, which is a very complex piece with many different angles, there may be some problems with some parts of the narrative, but the chain of command, how the U.S. organized it, who was involved, and how the American government profited from it, because this was the number one objective of the Americans from the beginning, even before the start of the special military operation, to isolate Germany from Russia.
Right.
So from a tactical point of view, as it stands, it works. But we don't know what's going to happen next, of course.
Right. I wish we could have more time to focus on that. But another interesting point you mentioned about, of course, this is the reality of the international community. We see that the global south, the absolute number of developing countries, they refused to come on board with Western countries to impose sanctions, for example, on Russia or against Russia in that regard. What do you make of that?
This is very important because the process of, let's say, agglutination and organization and integration of different areas of the global south, which was picking up speed a year ago, these past few months, and now it's like a Chinese high-speed rail. It's very, very fast and congregating all different areas. And that means Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the expansion of BRICS. They're going to become BRICS Plus starting this year, probably with the three first candidates becoming members of BRICS, Algeria, Iran, and Argentina. And this is emphasized and encouraged by China and by Russia at the same time. The Eurasian Economic Union, which they are designing a currency to bypass the US dollar, and there are consultations with the Chinese as well by the Eurasian Economic Commission. So when we put this organization framework all together, this spells out the Global South uniting closer and closer, and we see the world split between the US and their NATO vassals on one side, which makes, 12% of the global population at best, and the 88%, which represent the Global South, and including big powers, China, Russia, India, Brazil, the BRICS members, and the expanded BRICS members, which even some American analysts, financial analysts like Zoltan Pozsar, have already said this is the G7 of the East, which is a nice way of putting it, because the G7, as we know it, is dead. The only thing that they have at the moment, okay, let's sanction Russia even more, and let's sanction, which is even crazier, Chinese companies, Iranian companies, and North Korean companies. They are, according to the Americans, helping the Russian military effort. So the world is divided in two. And the organization of the Global South is the most important movement taking place in the world right now. And it's directly connected with the absolute failure of the West to isolate and to destroy Russia.
Well, earlier the Kremlin said Joe Biden has a key to ending the conflict in Ukraine by directing Kyiv, but Washington has so far not been willing to use its leverage and instead insist on pumping weapons into Ukraine. So as long as the U.S. continues with the weapons supply to Ukraine,
yes,
and peace will not arrive, and the truce is still far away.
Well, they don't want to end the war. They never did. They wanted to provoke a war, and they wanted to have a sort of remix of the Afghan jihad in the 1980s, when they were weaponizing, financing, and instrumentalizing jihadis, not only in Afghanistan, from all over the Arab world, against the Soviet Union. And in the end, of course, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in 1988. They think that they can do the same thing, as a sort of a prolonged Afghanistan remixed in Ukraine. Obviously, it didn't work. The Russians, they have the power to finish this war in 20 minutes with their hypersonic weapons, for instance. They don't want it. The Americans have the power to end this war with one phone call from the White House or from the CIA handlers to Kiev. It's very, very simple. Of course, they don't want it. They had a chance to end this war last year in April, when there were negotiations in Istanbul, where the Russians and the Americans were almost reaching a deal, and the Anglo-Americans intervened and squashed it. And the war kept going on, and in fact was increased during the next few months. The weaponizing is crazy because the rules change virtually every month. No, we're not going to send tanks. They are going to send tanks. No, we're not going to send fighter jets. Soon they're going to send fighter jets. So we know there's one red line after another. The Russians, they look at it and they said, okay, we can cope with any red line. And the only response that the collective West, the US and NATO, have is we need to weaponize Ukraine to death, which is what they're doing. The problem is this to death is to the death of every Ukrainian, in fact. And the Russians, they continue with their military approach, which is to reconquer territory, conquer more territory, and then one day they're going to stop because they'll be happy with it. Mm-hmm. And of course, the collective West will be desperate about it. And now they're trying to send some, let's say, some carrots to the Russians. Let's try a ceasefire, let's try a peace plan, etc. And the Russians know, and this is being said explicitly by Putin, by Lavrov, by Medvedev, we cannot trust anything that they say,
No.
and especially what they write.
Right. Well, thank you, Pep. Thank you for your time and insight. Hopefully, we can have you again on our show.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers.
Fraser, welcome to the show. We know that in addition to being a senior advisor to the European Policy Center in Brussels, you were formerly director of the EU-Russia Center and the author of several books focusing mainly on European foreign policy. So speak of the foreign policy, how would you characterize how the EU's role in the ongoing Ukraine war has changed from the beginning until where we are now 1 year later?
Well, I think many commentators assumed it would be rather like the Iraq war with intense bombardment of cities and the regime collapsing very quickly. And certainly I think that was how Russia foresaw the conflict. But Ukraine, a country of over 40 million people, proved far more resilient than most people thought, pushed back Russian troops. And now we're in a kind of stalemate situation, rather akin to the First World War. And this looks like continuing for some long period, because no one is going to have an absolute superiority on the battlefield. So unfortunately, I think we are now in the process of a military stalemate.
Mm-hmm. Well, not long ago, the German foreign minister talked about, quote, we are at a war with Russia. And of course, we have NATO, senior NATO officials saying that NATO is prepared for military confrontation with Russia. Are you seeing that, this situation, or the tension is escalating? Or are you seeing that, EU countries are more directly involved in this conflict?
The tension has increased between both the EU and Russia and NATO and Russia for obvious reasons. And the EU has taken a number of steps to support Ukraine in its attempt to maintain territorial integrity and sovereignty, which was supported by all United Nations members. And individual countries in the EU and NATO have been helping the supply of defensive weapons to Ukraine to ensure that there is no complete sort of military victory by Russia in the short term. So that is the situation. It's poured enormous strain on relations, not only between the EU and Russia, but also the EU and some other partners. And the former Chinese ambassador to the EU said it was also a factor in the sort of pause in the development of good relations between the EU and China. So the implications of the war in Ukraine are very, very multifarious indeed.
Well, that's right. If we look back, over the past year, in particular, at the beginning of the war, there were debates, obviously, about the reasons or factors leading to the conflict. Russians would say, would point a finger at NATO expansion or the U.S. rule, and of course, for European countries or Western countries in general, the blame obviously is on Russia alone. Now look back, in your opinion, what led to the Ukraine crisis? Have you found any new insights into what could be the roots of the war, or maybe if there is something they could do, they could have done probably, to avoid being in such an uncomfortable position now?
The roots of the war are essentially in the mind of President Putin. And if you go back to the creation of Ukraine, Ukraine was accepted as a sovereign state by Russia in 1991, along with all other members of the United Nations. In 1994, Russia, together with the United States and the United Kingdom, signed a memorandum in Budapest saying that they would always support the security and integrity of Ukraine if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And of course, that Budapest agreement was simply forgotten. I think essentially the war belongs to Mr. Putin. It's his war, and he has to figure out how to get out of it, because at the moment I don't see any compromise on the table.
Mm-hmm. Well, the past year, has certainly not been easy for the EU countries. We know that, the conflict, inflation, of course, because of the tension, and energy crisis, for example. How do those factors, impact European countries? Probably, what do you see, looking into the 2023? What will be the major priorities for the EU and EU countries?
Well, it's been a huge impact, the war on Europe and the rest of the world. And I think for the EU, their number one priority is securing alternative energy supplies, because Europe was over-dependent on Russia. Some countries were almost 100% on Russian supplies. So very rapidly, EU countries had to secure alternatives from the Middle East, from Africa, from the United States, Norway. And this was something that led to a sharp increase in energy costs in Europe, which led to higher inflation. And this came on top of the pandemic, and countries were just starting to recover from the pandemic when this happened. And so this has been a shock, a real economic shock to European countries. And it's led to a decline in output, only now just stabilizing, and probably will be recovering this coming year. But it also has led to a discussion about how Europe should reorientate its supply chains to ensure that it's no longer dependent on countries like Russia for key products. Secondly, in terms of priorities, I think it's made the European governments determined to be more resilient, to be more self-sufficient, to ensure that they can compete almost as a bloc in the very different world circumstances. And this includes being able to stand up to the United States in areas like digital technology, because the United States is actually pursuing quite a protectionist path at the moment. And the third area and priority is, of course, climate change. I mean, Europe still wants to be regarded, and I think is regarded, as a leader in climate change, even though there have been some temporary setbacks. For example, some of the coal-fired power stations in Germany, which were due to shut this year, have been kept open for a longer period. So I think these are the main priorities for the EU, and all the leaders recognize that they have to pull together. I mean, for example, 2 or 3 years ago, after Brexit, some people thought other countries might leave. In fact, no country wants to leave. There's no political party anywhere in the EU suggesting that their country should leave the EU. So I think the last 2 years has brought the European Union countries closer together.
Closer together, more solidarity. And of course, at the same time, some would say they expressed the concern that European countries could be pushed into the front line of the conflict, as at least some of the countries appear to be competing to express or to supply weapons to the Ukrainian side. And is that a legitimate concern?
Yes, I think some governments, some politicians are concerned about this. So that's why governments have been very careful to ensure, firstly, that the weapons are essentially defensive. They've not been offering Ukraine any missiles that could strike Russian territory. It's essentially weapons to ensure that they can counter any Russian offensive. And I think equally, Western governments have been very clear to Russia that they will not supply Ukraine with any weapons that could impact, Russian territory direct. The aim is simply to help Ukraine defend its territory, and if possible, recapture the territory that has been taken by Russian forces since last year. That's the aim of the weapons supplies to Ukraine.
Fraser, you mentioned earlier all those weapons supplied from European countries, being defensive, basically, with the concern of avoiding escalation. But then we are seeing that, missiles and also tanks, and also probably fighter jets could be supplied to the Ukrainian side. Is there a concern of, possible escalation?
Well, the decision to supply tanks was based on the understanding that they would only be used on the territory of Ukraine, and that is something that the Ukrainians have accepted. Similarly, fighter jets are not going to be delivered anytime soon. At the moment, the emphasis is on anti-aircraft weapons, and the Ukraine Air Force would need time to train pilots to use planes, but it's not going to be, I think, a game changer. I think as I say, we're in a stalemate, and we have to try and build up an international community of pressures on particularly Russia to say, look, this is unacceptable, and we have to withdraw troops to the previous position and then have some talks. I mean, the Western position is we cannot press Ukraine to accept that Russia has gained territory by its military actions, and this is acceptable, because that simply would go against international law and all United Nations conventions.